Daniel Mercer took a deep breath as he stepped into his new apartment. The dimly lit hallway of Blackwood Heights loomed behind him, the peeling wallpaper and flickering lights giving the building an unsettling atmosphere. He had been searching for a cheap place to stay after moving to the city, and apartment 709 was the best deal he could find. It was a modest one-bedroom unit, with creaky wooden floors and a faint musty smell. The landlord, Mr. Holloway, had assured him the apartment was in good condition, though his eyes darted away when Daniel asked why it had been vacant for so long. Daniel set down his suitcase and wandered through the space, inspecting the small kitchen and the single window that overlooked the cityscape. As he moved to close the window, a strange sensation prickled the back of his neck, like someone was watching him. He turned sharply, but the room was empty. Shaking off the unease, Daniel sighed. Great. First night, and I'm already scaring myself. But deep down, something felt off. And soon, he would realize he wasn't alone in apartment 709. Daniel spent the rest of the evening unpacking his things, trying to ignore the unsettling atmosphere of his new apartment. The silence was thick, pressing against his ears like a weighted blanket. Occasionally, he could hear the muffled sounds of the city outside, but inside it was eerily still. As night fell, Daniel settled onto his couch with a beer, flipping through channels on the old television. The static on some of the stations crackled loudly before clearing up, but he chalked it up to the outdated wiring in the building. Around midnight, just as he was dozing off, a noise made him sit up straight. Thud! A heavy, deliberate sound echoed from the apartment next door, apartment 710. It was as if something large had fallen to the floor. Daniel frowned. He hadn't seen anyone move in or out of that unit when he arrived, and Mr. Holloway hadn't mentioned a neighbor. Maybe someone had just moved in. Another thud, then a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Daniel turned off the TV and listened closely. Silence. Then bang, bang, bang. 3 loud, forceful knocks rattled the wall he shared with apartment 710. Daniel's breath hitched. The knocks were so strong that his picture frames vibrated slightly. He hesitated for a moment before calling out. Hey, everything okay over there? No response. Feeling uneasy, he stood up and walked toward the wall, pressing his ear against it. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then, just as he was about to pull away, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, right on the other side of the wall. Daniel's stomach twisted. He couldn't make out the words, but the whispering voice was rapid and urgent, like someone muttering frantically. A chill ran down his spine. He took a step back, his heart pounding. Maybe it was a neighbor sleep-talking, or maybe the walls were just thin, and he was overhearing a late-night phone call. Convincing himself it was nothing, Daniel shook his head and muttered, I need some sleep. But as he turned off the lights and climbed into bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, was in the apartment next door, and it was trying to get his attention. Daniel awoke to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, a barely noticeable noise against the silence of the apartment. But as he blinked awake in the darkness, his ears adjusted, and he realized it was coming from the wall next to his bed, the wall he shared with apartment 710. Long, deliberate scratches like fingernails dragging against wood. Daniel sat up, his pulse quickening. He turned on the bedside lamp, bathing the room in dim yellow light. The scratching stopped instantly. Silence. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. It's just a rat. Or old pipes. His mind searched for logical explanations, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Deciding he needed water, he got out of bed and walked to the kitchen. As he poured himself a glass, a loud thud made him jump. It came from the front door. A knock. Daniel hesitated, glancing at the clock, 3:12 a.m. Who the hell would be knocking at this hour? Cautiously, he walked to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. His stomach twisted. Did I imagine it? Then another knock. Harder. Louder. Daniel's breath hitched. He checked the peephole again. Still nothing. A shiver crawled up his spine. Slowly, he unlocked the door and cracked it open, peering into the dimly lit corridor. Nothing. The hallway stretched in both directions, eerily silent. The only movement came from a single flickering light above apartment 710's door. Daniel's eyes locked onto it. The door to 710 was slightly ajar. A dark sliver of space beckoned from inside, as if the apartment were waiting for him to step closer. A sudden chill filled the air, and for the first time, Daniel realized something. The hallway felt wrong. It was too still, too heavy, as if the very air had weight. Then, from deep inside apartment 710, he heard it. A low whisper. 2 words. Help me. Daniel's blood turned ice cold. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The whisper had been faint, almost lost beneath the flickering hum of the hallway light. But he had heard it, clear enough to freeze him in place. Help me. His eyes remained locked on apartment 710's door, still slightly ajar. A rational part of him screamed, "Don't go in," but another part, a darker curiosity, urged him forward. Maybe someone really was in trouble. Maybe. Suddenly, the door creaked open wider. Daniel's heart pounded as an icy draft rushed out from inside, carrying with it a sickly, decayed scent. The apartment beyond was pitch black, an unnatural void. Something about that darkness felt wrong. Every instinct told him to turn back, to lock his own door, and pretend he hadn't heard anything. But then, thump, a sound from deep inside the unit. A heavy, dragging noise, like something shifting in the darkness. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Coming toward the door. Daniel took a step back. His breath hitched. The footsteps stopped just beyond the threshold, but he still couldn't see anything inside, just a wall of endless black. And then, a whisper, right at the doorframe. "Come in." Daniel stumbled back, slamming his door shut. His hands shook as he locked it, twisting the deadbolt twice for good measure. Silence. Then bang! A violent knock on his door. Daniel jumped, his back pressing against the wood. His pulse thundered in his ears as another knock followed, then another, faster, more aggressive. He held his breath, his entire body stiff with terror. The knocking continued for what felt like forever, rattling the door in its frame. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. Daniel stood there, heart hammering, waiting for something, anything, to happen next. But the hallway outside remained still. And then, from the other side of the door, a final whisper. "I'll see you soon." Daniel didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Morning light filtered through Daniel's curtains, but it did little to shake off the unease that had settled in his bones. He hadn't slept, not after what happened last night. Every creak of the apartment, every distant sound in the hallway had sent his heart racing. Now, in the daylight, he tried to convince himself it had been some kind of sleep-deprived hallucination. Maybe I imagined the whispering. Maybe the knocking was just my nerves playing tricks on me. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. After a quick shower, Daniel decided he needed answers. He wasn't sure where to start. Mr. Holloway, the landlord, had avoided his questions before. But maybe one of the neighbors knew something about apartment 710. He stepped out into the hallway, half expecting to find the door to 710 still slightly open. But it wasn't. It was shut tight, looking just as unremarkable as any other door in the building. As Daniel locked his own door behind him, something caught his attention, a stain on the hallway floor. A dark streak, leading from apartment 710's door, right to his. Daniel's stomach turned. He crouched down, hesitantly running his fingers over it. Sticky. It looked like a smear of something black. Dried, yet fresh enough to leave residue. His pulse quickened. He wiped his hand on his jeans, standing quickly. "I need to get out of here." He turned to walk down the hall, and froze. Someone was standing at the end of the corridor. A figure. Tall. Motionless. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The person was facing him, but their features were wrong. The hallway's dim lighting cast their face in deep shadow, making it impossible to see any details. But there was something unnatural about the way they stood. Too stiff, too still. Daniel swallowed hard. Hey," he called hesitantly. "Do you live here?" No response. The figure didn't move. Didn't even breathe. A cold sensation crept up Daniel's spine. The longer he stared, the more he realized something horrifying. The figure wasn't just standing in the shadow. It was the shadow, a human-shaped void, darker than the dim hallway, completely featureless. Then, as if it knew he had figured it out, it twitched, just the slightest jerk of the head, as if acknowledging him. Daniel stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. Then, in the blink of an eye, the shadow figure rushed toward him. A split second of pure, inhuman speed. Daniel yelped and scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet as he fumbled for his apartment door. His shaking hands barely managed to get the key in the lock. Just as he threw the door open and lunged inside, the hallway was empty. The shadow was gone. Daniel slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as he could. His whole body was trembling. What the hell was that? He pressed his back against the door, breathing heavily. And that's when he noticed. The air in his apartment was freezing. His breath came out in small white puffs. His hands ached from the sudden chill. The temperature had dropped impossibly low in mere seconds. And then, from the corner of his eye, a figure standing in the reflection of his TV screen. Right behind him, Daniel's blood turned to ice. He didn't dare move. In the reflection of his TV screen, the figure stood just behind him, a tall, shadowy silhouette, featureless and still. The same presence from the hallway. It wasn't supposed to be here. His breath hitched as he forced himself to think. Don't turn around. His instincts screamed that if he did, if he made eye contact with whatever was behind him, something terrible would happen. But he couldn't just stand there, paralyzed. Summoning every ounce of willpower, Daniel took a slow, deliberate step forward, toward the couch, away from the reflection. The floor creaked under his weight. The figure moved. Not in the TV reflection, but in the room itself. Daniel felt the shift in the air, heard the faintest scrape of something dragging along the wooden floor behind him. Then a breath, right against the back of his neck. Daniel lunged forward, spinning around at the last second. Nothing. The room was empty. The only sound was his own ragged breathing, the only movement the flickering light above his kitchen sink. The shadow figure was gone, but the cold remained. Daniel stood there, his fists clenched, trying to slow his racing heart. His apartment felt wrong, like something unseen still lingered. Watching, waiting. He needed to get out. Grabbing his jacket, he rushed for the door, barely remembering to lock it behind him as he stepped out into the hallway. The air out here was thick with an unnatural silence. The flickering light above apartment 710 buzzed softly, casting erratic shadows along the walls. Daniel exhaled sharply and forced himself to walk toward the elevator. He needed answers now, and he knew exactly where to start. Chapter 7, Mr. Holloway's Warning. Daniel found Mr. Holloway in the building's cramped office on the ground floor. The old landlord sat behind a cluttered desk, flipping through a yellowed ledger. He looked up as Daniel entered, his wrinkled face tightening. "Mercer," Holloway said, his voice raspy. "Something wrong?" Daniel hesitated, then leaned forward. "It's about apartment 710. Mr. Holloway's eyes darkened. He didn't speak. Daniel pressed on. "I heard noises last night, and someone was knocking on my door at 3 in the morning. But when I checked, the hallway was empty." Still, Mr. Holloway said nothing. Daniel's voice lowered. "And this morning, he hesitated, debating whether to tell the landlord about the shadow in the hallway. Would Holloway even believe him? Instead, he asked, "Who lives in 710? The landlord's jaw tightened. He let out a slow breath, setting his pen down. "Nobody," he muttered. Daniel frowned. "What do you mean nobody?" "Someone was in there." Holloway shook his head. "No one's rented 710 in years." A cold sensation crawled over Daniel's skin. "That's not possible. I saw the door open last night. I heard someone inside." The old man met his eyes, and for the first time, Daniel saw something unsettling: fear. Mr. Holloway leaned forward. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You need to stay away from that apartment." Daniel's stomach twisted. "Why?" The landlord exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. He looked older now, more tired. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "There was a tenant there, years ago. Woman named Eleanor Reeves." Daniel stayed silent, waiting. "She lived alone," Holloway continued. "Kept to herself. No friends, no family. Barely spoke to anyone. Then one day, neighbors started complaining. Said they'd hear her talking to someone in the middle of the night. Whispering." Daniel's heart pounded. "They thought she had a visitor," Holloway said. "But no one ever saw anyone come in or out. Just her. Always her." Daniel swallowed hard. Then the noises started. Scratching. Banging on the walls. People in the apartments nearby said they'd hear knocks at their doors late at night. "Just like you." Daniel felt a chill settle in his bones. "What happened to her?" Mr. Holloway hesitated before answering. "One night, she started screaming." The words sent a shiver through Daniel. "The neighbors called the police. When they got there, they found her inside. Alone." Daniel leaned in. "Was she hurt?" The landlord shook his head. "No, not a single mark on her." "Then what?" "She was dead." Daniel's breath caught. Mr. Holloway's face darkened. "They found her sitting in the middle of the room. Eyes wide open. Mouth stretched in a scream. Like she'd seen something. Something so terrible, it killed her right there." Daniel's skin prickled. "The coroner couldn't explain it," Holloway muttered. "No signs of struggle. No heart attack. She was just gone." Silence hung between them. Then Mr. Holloway whispered, "And that should have been the end of it." Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. But it wasn't. The old man shook his head. After she died, the knocking didn't stop. Daniel felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. The next tenant didn't last 2 weeks, Holloway continued. Said he kept waking up at night to someone whispering in his ear. Every time he checked, the apartment was empty. One night, he saw a figure standing at his door. Daniel's breath hitched. He left the next morning, Holloway said. After that, no one stayed in 710 for long. They'd complain about the same things, the knocking, the voices, the feeling of being watched. Daniel thought about his own experience. The knocking, the whispering, the shadow in the hallway. He forced himself to ask, what happens if someone stays? Mr. Holloway's expression turned grave. The last tenant who tried. His voice trailed off, then he shook his head. He was found in his bathtub. Water was ice cold. His face. Daniel felt his stomach clench. His face was frozen in a scream, Holloway whispered. Just like Eleanor. A long silence stretched between them. Then the landlord fixed Daniel with a hard stare. You need to be careful, Mercer, he said. Don't answer the knocking. Don't listen to the whispers. And whatever you do, his voice dropped to a chilling hush. Never open your door at night. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat, because deep down, he knew it was already too late. Daniel left the office with a hollow feeling in his chest. His legs carried him back toward the elevator, but his mind was elsewhere, stuck on Mr. Holloway's words. Never open your door at night. But he already had. The thought sent a sickening chill down his spine. Had that been some kind of invitation? Had he let it in? The elevator doors slid open, and Daniel stepped inside, pressing the button for the 7th floor. The ride up was agonizingly slow, each second stretching as his paranoia grew. When the doors finally opened, he stepped into the hallway cautiously, his eyes flicking toward apartment 710. The door was still shut. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, something felt wrong. Daniel turned toward his own apartment, but as he reached for the doorknob, his hand froze. The dark streak from earlier, the stain leading from 710's door to his own, was darker now. Thicker. And in the middle of it, a single handprint. Daniel's stomach twisted. The print was smeared, elongated, as if the fingers had been dragged across the wood. And the color, not quite blood, not quite ink. Something darker. Something unnatural. A lump formed in his throat. Had the mark been there before? He wasn't sure anymore. His mind was racing too fast to think straight. A sudden creak from down the hall made him snap his head up. His breath caught. The door to apartment 710 was open again. A sliver of blackness gaped from inside. The same suffocating darkness as before. But this time something was different. This time, something was standing in the doorway. A shape. Tall. Motionless. Watching. Daniel's vision tunneled, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. Move. Move now. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking violently as he jammed one into the lock. Behind him, a whisper slithered through the air. You let me in. Daniel shoved his door open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps. He pressed his forehead against the door, willing himself to calm down. But then, tap, 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 a light knock. From inside his apartment. Daniel whirled around, his stomach dropping. The sound had come from his bedroom. His pulse thundered in his ears. The air in the room had turned frigid again, his breath visible in the dim light. Then, from the shadows of his open bedroom door, a shape shifted. Daniel stumbled back. The silhouette was just standing there. And then, it rushed toward him. Daniel barely had time to react before the shadowy figure lunged at him. A wave of paralyzing cold washed over him as it closed the distance in an instant, its form shifting unnaturally as it moved. His breath came out in sharp gasps, his limbs frozen in terror. Then slam! The force of the impact knocked him off his feet. He hit the floor hard, his back slamming against the wood. A sharp pain shot up his spine, but he barely noticed, because the thing was on top of him. It wasn't human. A mass of shifting darkness, its face a swirling void. No eyes, no mouth, just a black abyss where a face should be. It loomed over him, pressing down, suffocating. A horrific whisper filled his ears. You shouldn't have let me in. Daniel screamed. With every ounce of strength he had, he shoved at the figure, his fingers passing through it like smoke. Yet somehow it still held him down. The weight of it was unbearable. His lungs burned as icy tendrils coiled around his throat, squeezing. His vision blurred. Then, just as his strength was failing, bang! 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 3 loud knocks rattled his apartment door. The entity froze. For a split second, the weight on Daniel's chest lifted. Seizing his chance, he rolled to the side, gasping for air. His vision swam, his limbs weak. The knocks came again, harder, more urgent. Daniel turned toward the door, his mind spinning. Who the hell? But when he looked back, the figure was gone. The apartment was silent. Daniel's body trembled as he pushed himself upright. His skin was ice cold, his breaths ragged. He could still feel the imprint of the thing's presence, like a lingering shadow in his bones. Slowly, he stumbled toward the door. His fingers hovered over the handle. A horrible thought crept into his mind. What if it wasn't help? What if whatever was outside was worse? Another knock, this time softer. Then, a voice. Daniel opened the door. His blood ran cold. Because whoever, or whatever, was outside, it knew his name. Daniel's breath came in short, ragged gasps. The voice on the other side of the door, it shouldn't have known his name. He hadn't told anyone about what was happening. Hadn't spoken to his neighbors. The only person who knew was Mr. Holloway. And this wasn't Mr. Holloway. A slow, deliberate tap came against the wood. Daniel. The voice was soft, almost familiar, but warped, like it wasn't meant for human ears. Like something pretending to be human. Daniel backed away. His instincts screamed at him, don't open the door. Don't even look at it. His mind raced. If he ignored it, would it go away? Then the voice changed. It became her voice. Daniel, please. Let me in. His stomach clenched. No, it couldn't be. Emily. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't heard her voice in years. Not since. His hands shook. It sounded just like her. The same softness, the same desperate plea she had whispered that night before she... No, this isn't real. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his back against the cold wall. But the voice at the door kept talking. You left me, Daniel. His chest tightened. You didn't even say goodbye. His breath hitched. His mind screamed at him to block it out, to ignore it, but it was her. His first love. His biggest regret. The one person he had failed. The voice trembled now, fragile and broken. Daniel, I don't want to be alone anymore. A cold tear slipped down his cheek. No, it's not her. It can't be her. But his body moved anyway. Before he could stop himself, his trembling fingers reached for the lock. The moment his skin brushed the cold metal. Bang! A sudden, violent slam shook the door. Daniel stumbled back, his heart leaping into his throat. The voice was gone. Now only silence. No knocking. No whispers. Just a suffocating stillness. Then, a single whisper, so close it might as well have been in his ear. Almost. Daniel choked on his own breath. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the freezing air, curling around him like unseen fingers. His knees nearly buckled. He clutched his head, forcing himself to breathe. It almost had me. It knew exactly how to get in. His past. His grief. His guilt. And he had nearly let it in. His stomach twisted as realization sank in. This thing doesn't just haunt. It hunts. Daniel's heart pounded as he paced across the room, his mind in chaos. The silence stretched around him, suffocating. He felt it, the oppressive weight of something watching, waiting. The same unease that had plagued him since the first night. It had almost gotten to him. The voice, the way it mimicked Emily's, twisted with his deepest regrets and pain. It had been so close. Too close. He couldn't stay here. He had to leave. There was nothing left for him in this apartment, not with whatever was lingering, hunting, waiting for him to open the door. Daniel grabbed his jacket from the couch and rushed to the door, his fingers numb as they fumbled with the locks. He had to get out, get away from the thing. Whatever it was, that wanted him. But as his hand touched the handle, the knocking came again. Tap, tap, tap. At first, it was faint, just a distant sound. But it grew louder, closer, and more insistent with every passing second. Daniel's skin prickled. He turned toward the door, his breath shallow and quick. Daniel. The voice was clearer now. But it wasn't Emily's anymore. It was something else. Something darker. It was a voice he didn't recognize. It slithered through the cracks of the door, a low, guttural whisper that reverberated in his skull. You can't run from me. Daniel's heart raced, his thoughts frantic. His fingers tightened around the doorknob, as if he could will the presence outside to vanish. But the knocks grew louder, the voice more demanding. Open the door. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted. The cold grew unbearable, like an ice storm had taken over the apartment. Daniel could feel the chill seeping into his bones, freezing him in place. He shivered uncontrollably, his teeth chattering. His head swam, dizziness overtaking him as he fought to stay conscious. And then he heard it, the sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps dragging across the floor of the hallway outside his apartment. Each step seemed to reverberate deep in his chest, like the sound of a funeral march. It was coming for him. He couldn't move. Then a faint whisper, closer now. "I'm here, Daniel." It wasn't the voice of the thing he had heard before. It was deeper, stronger, and it was inside the apartment now. Daniel's vision blurred as he turned toward the source of the sound, the dark hallway stretching before him like a nightmare made real. His legs trembled, and he staggered backward. Suddenly the lights flickered, and then they went out entirely. For a moment, the room was plunged into complete darkness. Daniel's breathing was all he could hear, loud, panicked, terrified. He reached out, blindly groping the wall for any sense of stability. Then, through the suffocating darkness, he heard it again. A whisper. "I know you." And then, the door creaked. Slowly, the door to his bedroom opened, an inch at a time. The heavy weight of the darkness behind it seemed to press against him, like something was trying to squeeze its way through. The voice was now inside his head. "You can't run from me. You can't hide. You will never escape." And then, the door slammed open with a deafening force, throwing Daniel back against the wall. A figure emerged from the darkness. Its shape was indistinct, a moving blur of shadows that seemed to shift and writhe in the dark. But it wasn't the same thing he had seen before. This was something more ancient. Its presence was overpowering, suffocating, like it had lived in the very bones of the building itself. The temperature dropped again, so cold, Daniel's breath became visible, even in the pitch-black room. The figure loomed over him. Daniel could feel the weight of its gaze on him, though he could see nothing, just the suffocating blackness that surrounded him. The whispers grew louder, an almost deafening chorus. "You're mine now. You'll never leave." Daniel gasped, reaching for anything that could save him. But the figure was too fast, too powerful. It moved so quickly, its dark shape flowing over him like smoke, and suddenly he was pulled from his feet, thrown across the room. The floor slammed into his back, and the pain shot through him like a lightning bolt. He cried out, his chest heaving. And then, the figure was on top of him. Its shadowy tendrils wrapped around him, binding him, holding him down with an unrelenting force. His skin felt like it was burning, freezing and scorching at the same time. His heart raced as he gasped for air, his body frozen, unable to move. In his ear, the whispers turned into a roar. "You're mine. Forever. You'll never escape." Daniel's vision started to fade. The edges of the room blurred, and he felt himself slipping, losing himself to the darkness. Just before everything went black, the last thing he heard was the voice, clear and triumphant. "You opened the door. Now you belong to me." And then nothing. The darkness that enveloped Daniel was all-consuming. It was thick, suffocating, like being swallowed whole by the void itself. For what felt like an eternity, he drifted, unable to move or think, lost in the empty silence. His body felt weightless, numb, disconnected from his mind, as though it had ceased to exist altogether. Then, a cold pinprick of sensation in his chest. He could feel his heart again, beating weakly, almost as if it had forgotten how. A faint pulse of life. And then, the whispers returned. They slithered into his consciousness, seeping through the cracks in his mind like a vile poison. Voices. Countless voices, speaking at once, overlapping in a cacophony of torment. "You are nothing. You are mine. You will never escape." Daniel tried to scream, but no sound came. His lips barely moved. His lungs couldn't find air. It was as if he were submerged in a pool of ice-cold water, unable to break the surface. Suddenly, the voices stopped. A single, low murmur lingered in the air, familiar. "Daniel." The name echoed in his mind, just like it had before. The voice, soft and pleading. It wasn't the creature anymore. It was something different. But it was still here. "Emily." The pain shot through his chest again, sharper this time. The image of her face, her smile, flashed in his mind, and his body recoiled at the memory. How could he have left her? How could he have failed her? The last time he had seen her, he'd promised he would come back. But he never did. And now, in the depths of this suffocating void, her presence felt so real, so tangible. Was she here? Was she the one reaching out to him? "Daniel, please." The voice pleaded again, this time more urgent. It cracked with a desperation he couldn't ignore. His heart twisted painfully in his chest, and his mind screamed for him to reach out, to respond. But he couldn't. He was trapped in this endless dark void, unable to move, unable to break free. And then the weight shifted. It wasn't just the whispers now. The darkness moved. Something enormous was shifting within it. Something ancient and malevolent, a presence far too powerful to be anything from this world. The blackness rippled around him, like an ocean, threatening to swallow him whole. The voice of Emily was drowned out by a deep, primal growl. "You do not belong here." Daniel's body shook violently as the growl vibrated through him. He tried to call out, but the words choked in his throat. The presence, this force, felt like it was crushing him from the inside. Every inch of him burned with the intensity of the thing's rage. He was nothing to it, a mere speck of dust, an insignificant nothing. But it wanted him. It always had. Suddenly, the pressure loosened for just a moment. Daniel gasped. Light, dim, flickering, pierced the darkness like a dying star. He blinked rapidly, trying to focus. The light shifted, flaring brighter, and then a face. A figure. At first, he couldn't make out the details. It was a silhouette against the fading light, a tall, shadowy figure standing just beyond his reach. But then, the face slowly became clearer. And Daniel's heart stopped. It was Mr. Holloway. The man's face was twisted, distorted, his eyes black voids staring out at him. His skin was pale and cracked, like it was breaking apart at the edges. The air around him crackled with an unnatural energy, a sickly aura of death. Daniel's mouth went dry. "How? You should have listened to me." Mr. Holloway's voice was different now, low, gravelly, full of malice. Daniel tried to speak, but his voice was trapped within him, unable to break free. His chest tightened, his head pounding with the force of the overwhelming pressure. His vision blurred as the world around him began to warp and twist. Nothing made sense. "You've opened the door," Mr. Holloway continued, his smile now twisted into something grotesque. "You've allowed it to feed on you." Daniel tried to reach out, to beg for help, but the words never came. His body, too weak, too consumed by the darkness, failed him. The figure before him leaned in closer, its breath hot against Daniel's face. The air grew colder, the shadows growing heavier. "It's too late," Holloway whispered. "You're already part of it. There's no going back." The world around Daniel collapsed. He felt himself falling deeper into the abyss, the edges of reality blurring into a swirling mass of shapes and colors he could barely comprehend. The air turned to liquid, and his limbs felt like they were moving through thick molasses. And then, just when he thought he would drown in it, a scream, a deafening, shrill scream split through the darkness, snapping Daniel from his descent. It echoed through the void, a cry full of pain, terror, and desperation. It was Emily's voice. Daniel's heart lurched. The scream, it was real. With every ounce of willpower, he reached out. He didn't know how, he didn't know if it would work, but something inside him stirred. A memory, a thread of connection. And suddenly, light. The darkness broke apart like shattered glass, and the light rushed in, blinding and fierce. Daniel gasped, his chest aching with the sudden weight of his breath. And then he woke. His eyes snapped open to the sound of the door slamming shut. Daniel lay on the floor of his apartment, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. His heart hammered in his chest. He was back in the room, the apartment. But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. Daniel's breath came in shallow, ragged bursts. He blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the remnants of the nightmare that clung to his mind. His heart pounded, every beat reverberating in his skull. The apartment, though physically unchanged, felt wrong. The air was heavier, thicker. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, crawling like tendrils reaching for him. His skin tingled, a sense of being watched settling over him. He could feel it. It wasn't done with him. It knew he was awake. His eyes darted around the apartment, seeking some form of reassurance that the nightmare hadn't followed him. But the walls, the furniture, everything seemed to be alive with an unsettling, unnatural energy. The door to the hallway was still closed, locked. No sound from the outside. And yet, there was something off. Knock, knock, knock. The unmistakable sound rang out through the apartment, louder and more insistent than before. Daniel's body tensed, his muscles frozen in fear. He hadn't moved a step from the center of the room, yet somehow, it felt as though the knocking was right beside him. His pulse quickened, the familiar terror gripping his chest. The voice, too, returned. That voice. Daniel. His throat went dry. He knew that tone. It wasn't Mr. Holloway, and it wasn't Emily anymore. It was the thing, the entity, the shadow that had haunted him since the very first night. The knocking continued. Louder, angrier. You can't hide from me. You will come. Daniel's mind raced. He had to get out. Now. He turned to the window, his thoughts spiraling out of control. The street below was silent, the lights of the city faint against the heavy darkness. He could escape. Run. But he couldn't trust his instincts anymore. Because the moment he left this apartment, it would follow. It always did. It would find him, no matter where he went. Suddenly, a loud bang reverberated through the apartment. It was the door, the one leading to the bedroom. The same door that had been opened by that presence before. It was getting closer. Daniel stumbled back, his feet unsteady beneath him, his mind too slow to process his next move. And then he heard it, footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps, slowly pacing toward him from the hallway. The entity was coming for him, as it had promised. It was inevitable. A thought struck him then, a horrifying realization. The entity wasn't just after him. It was after something he had brought with him. Something he had brought back from the abyss. His pulse spiked again. He could feel it in his chest, deep in his bones. The truth was more terrifying than the very thing haunting him. It wanted him to open the door. It wanted him to let it back in. But it wasn't just about the door anymore. It was about the key. He was the key. The apartment. This entire building. It had all been a trap. A way to pull him back to the darkness. A way to pull him back to Emily. Daniel's hand trembled as he reached for his phone, his fingers numb with dread. But when he checked the screen, there was nothing. No signal. No connection. The apartment was cut off. Trapped. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The knocking too fell silent. Open it, Daniel. The voice was not distant now. It was right next to him, inside his head. Daniel's stomach churned. He could feel the coldness creeping in again, the same oppressive chill from earlier. His fingers tightened around his phone, his body fighting against the urge to obey. It was coming. It was already inside. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pushing inward, the darkness growing thicker. Come to me. Daniel couldn't breathe. He turned toward the door, half closed, the faintest sliver of light spilling from the hallway beyond. But before he could move, the door slammed open with a deafening crash. The thing stood there. Its form was shifting, warping, inhuman. There was no shape to it, no body. It was a void, a blackness so deep, it swallowed the light from the hallway, leaving only its presence to consume him. It reached toward him with an arm that twisted, contorted in ways no human form should ever do. Its fingers were like claws, impossibly long and sharp. The air around it crackled with an energy so cold it burned. Daniel backed away, his legs hitting the coffee table behind him. He tried to stand, but his body felt like lead. The air was suffocating, pressing down on him from all sides. It was here. It was too late. The thing's voice was a low growl, barely audible through the air that pressed in on him. You will serve. You will open the door. Daniel's throat was dry, his breath a strangled gasp. He couldn't think. His thoughts felt like they were being ripped from his mind by some unseen force. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a corruption. But something else broke through the haze in his mind. He remembered Mr. Holloway's warning. The curse. The reason this apartment was never meant for living. Daniel didn't have much time. With a sudden burst of clarity, he pushed himself off the ground, his fingers fumbling for the keys in his pocket. He didn't know why, but he needed them. He needed to break the curse, to end this nightmare. His hand closed around the keys. But the entity moved faster. Before he could react, it was upon him, its claws scraping against his skin, its presence choking the air around him. His vision blurred, the edges of the room dissolving into blackness. He tried to scream, tried to fight, but his body refused to obey. And then, the world went black. The world around Daniel felt like it was collapsing into nothingness. The darkness closed in on him, heavier than ever, suffocating him as if it were alive, a force bent on swallowing him whole. His lungs burned with each shallow breath, but no matter how hard he fought, the weight of the void refused to lift. His body was no longer his own. He felt like a puppet, pulled, twisted, and controlled by an unseen force. The thing's presence was too overwhelming, too powerful. It was consuming him from the inside out. Open the door. The voice echoed again, and this time it was in his mind, a brutal, commanding force that shattered his last resolve. It wasn't just speaking anymore. It was taking over. But even in the depths of his despair, one thought remained: he had to escape. Through the fog of fear, a spark of resistance ignited inside him. Daniel fought, with everything he had left, to break free from the grip of the darkness. His body trembled violently, but he refused to let go. He had to remember what was real. He had to find the way out. His eyes snapped open, and for a brief moment he saw the apartment again, the hallway, the door. The key. He could feel the metal in his pocket, cold against his fingers. With all his strength, Daniel reached for it, the key that had been his anchor, his last connection to the world. His fingers wrapped around it, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he focused on the sound of his own breath. He had to open the door, but not the one that led to the hallway. No, it was the door inside, the door to his soul. Daniel closed his eyes, focusing. Everything around him, every whisper, every terrifying movement, began to lose its grip on him. It wasn't real. The darkness, the entity, the torment, it all faded, slipping like sand through his fingers. He had to believe in something. With a final, desperate breath, Daniel reached out. The key in his hand grew hot, its energy pulsing with an ancient power. It wasn't just a key to a door, it was the key to his freedom. The door in his mind, the one that held the darkness, burst open. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a blinding light filled every corner of his consciousness. He was back in the apartment, standing at the edge of the living room. The walls were no longer pulsating with the suffocating energy of the entity. The air was clear, and the thing that had haunted him was gone. For the first time in days, Daniel felt the weight of his own body, the ground beneath his feet. He wasn't floating, lost in the void. He was here. The terror, the shadows, the oppressive pressure, they were gone. But even as he breathed in relief, a strange unease washed over him. The door to the apartment, it was wide open. He hadn't opened it. He hadn't touched the handle. And yet it was open, the hallway beyond bathed in an unnatural glow. He stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the threshold. The door. It had been opened, and something was waiting. But this time, Daniel wasn't afraid. He didn't need to run. He had already won. With one final step forward, he crossed the threshold of the apartment. And as he did, the world around him shifted once more. The lights flickered, the air thickened again, but this time, he was ready. He faced the darkness without hesitation. The thing that had tormented him, the thing that had claimed so many others, it was powerless now. Because the door had been closed. He had freed himself. And so, with every ounce of his strength, Daniel slammed the door behind him. And this time it stayed shut. Years passed. The apartment building was sold to new tenants, its history buried in whispers and rumors. People came and went, unaware of the horrors that once lurked within its walls. But one thing remained, the door. It stood locked and silent, in the far corner of the building's basement. No one ever went near it. It was a relic of something darker, something better left forgotten. And as for Daniel, he lived on. But he never forgot. The door, the shadow, the darkness, they stayed with him, hidden in the recesses of his mind, a constant reminder that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed.